The year is 790, and across the windswept fjords of Scandinavia, winter ice begins its reluctant retreat before the pale promise of northern spring. In this land, where mountains rise like sleeping giants from dark waters, where forests stretch beyond the horizon in endless carpets of pine and spruce, a people awakens who will soon write their names across the map of medieval Europe in letters of fire and blood. Yet for now, in these final years before the storm breaks, they remain what their ancestors have been for centuries: farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and warriors, bound to the harsh rhythms of a landscape that demands strength from all who would call it home. Picture yourself standing on the rocky shore of a Norwegian fjord, as morning mist rises from waters so still they mirror the sky like polished metal, while above you, on terraces carved from living stone, longhouses huddle together against the eternal wind that carries whispers of the open sea. The smoke that drifts from their hearth fires speaks of families gathered around glowing embers, their voices joining in the ancient songs that preserve memories reaching back through generations to times when gods walked among mortals and the barriers between myth and reality remain as thin as morning frost. These are the Northmen, though the world does not yet know that name or fear its implications. They call themselves by tribal designations that reflect the intimate geography of their homeland. Danes from the flat, fertile lands to the south, Swedes from the lake-dotted forests of the east, Norwegians from the coastal mountains that guard their western shores like ramparts built by giants. Their world extends no further than the horizon visible from their highest peaks, bounded by sea and forest, ice and stone. Yet within these seemingly narrow confines, they have developed a culture whose complexity will astonish the wider world when it finally emerges from northern obscurity. The longhouses that shelter them through the brutal Scandinavian winters represent more than mere architecture. They embody a way of life that transforms necessity into art, survival into community. Imagine the great hall of a Norse chieftain, its timber walls rising from foundations of carefully fitted stone, its roof supported by massive oak beams carved with intricate patterns that invoke the protection of ancient gods. Here, beneath the flickering light of oil lamps and the glow of the central hearth, extended families gather during the long months when snow locks the land in silence, their voices weaving the stories that will someday echo across Europe as the sagas that define a civilization. The culture that flourishes within these wooden walls possesses depths that the Christian monks who will soon encounter them could never imagine. These are not the simple barbarians that later chronicles will describe, but inheritors of traditions that reach back through centuries of careful preservation. Their poets, whom they call skalds, create verses of stunning complexity that rival anything produced in the monasteries of Ireland or the courts of Charlemagne. Their metalworkers forge jewelry and weapons that combine utility with beauty in ways that demonstrate sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. Their shipwrights craft vessels that will soon prove superior to anything sailing the waters of medieval Europe. Yet, beneath this cultural sophistication runs a current of restlessness that grows stronger with each passing season, fed by pressures that the isolated world of Scandinavia can no longer contain. The land that has nurtured these people for generations has reached the limits of its capacity to support their growing numbers. Young men who should inherit farms find themselves forced to seek new opportunities, while established families face the prospect of dividing their holdings among sons until none can maintain the standard of living their fathers knew. The very success of Norse civilization has created problems that their traditional world cannot solve. The solution that will transform history lies beached on every shore where these people have made their homes, waiting in the graceful forms of the vessels they have perfected through centuries of navigating the treacherous waters that surround their homeland. The longships that carry fishermen to their nets and traders to neighboring settlements possess capabilities that their builders are only beginning to understand. These craft can sail in waters too shallow for any other ocean-going vessel, can be carried overland between river systems, can weather storms that would destroy heavier ships, and can strike with the speed of lightning at targets that never suspect their approach. As the winter of 792 gives way to spring, something stirs in the collective consciousness of the northern peoples, a sensing that the time has come for expansion beyond the familiar boundaries that have defined their world since memory began. The young men who gather in their chieftains' halls speak increasingly of rumors carried by merchants who trade along the coasts, stories of wealthy monasteries across the North Sea where Christian monks hoard treasure with no warriors to protect it, of kingdoms grown soft through generations of peace, of opportunities waiting for those bold enough to reach across the waters and seize them. The gods themselves seem to whisper encouragement for such enterprises, for this is a culture that celebrates courage above all other virtues, that promises eternal glory to those who face death without flinching, that sees in the warrior's death a doorway to halls more glorious than any earthly dwelling. Odin the Allfather calls for heroes to join his chosen warriors in Valhalla, while Thor's hammer rings on the anvil of the storm clouds that gather over the northern seas. The very mythology that shapes Norse imagination points toward horizons beyond the known world, toward adventures that will test mortal courage against divine destiny. The Skalds, who preserve these traditions, speak of prophecies that foretell a time when the sons of the north will walk in lands where the sun shines warmer than it ever does in Scandinavia, when their dragon-prowed ships will carry them to shores rich with gold and silver, when their names will be spoken with fear and wonder by peoples who cannot imagine the harsh beauty of the fjords that forged them. These are not yet raiders or conquerors, but they carry within themselves the seeds of transformation that will soon bloom into the tempest that Europe will know as the Viking Age. The prophecies that echo through the mead halls of Scandinavia during those final winters before the storm breaks speak truly, though none among the Northmen can yet comprehend the magnitude of transformation that awaits both them and the wider world they are about to encounter. The restlessness that stirs in warrior hearts finds its first expression not through grand strategic planning, but through the simple convergence of opportunity and audacity that will characterize the Viking Age throughout its 3 centuries of dominance. Somewhere in the Danish lands, perhaps in the halls of a forgotten chieftain whose name history has not preserved, the decision forms that will launch 1,000 ships and reshape the destiny of medieval Europe. Picture the scene as it unfolds during the early months of 793, when the ice that has locked northern harbors through the long winter begins its retreat before spring's advancing warmth. The fjords and coastal waters that have held their frozen silence since autumn now echo with the sounds of preparation, the ring of hammers on ships' nails, the scrape of adzes shaping replacement planks, the calling of voices as crews prepare vessels that have weathered months of neglect. These are sounds that have marked every spring in Scandinavia for generations, yet this year they carry undertones of something different, something that speaks of journeys extending far beyond the familiar coastal routes that have bounded Norse ambition since time beyond memory. The ships that emerge from their winter shelters represent the culmination of centuries of maritime innovation, though their builders may not fully realize they have created instruments of historical transformation. These are not the crude boats that Christian chroniclers will describe in their shocked accounts of heathen depredations, but sophisticated vessels that embody the accumulated wisdom of generations who have learned to survive and prosper in some of the world's most challenging waters. The longships that will soon carry terror across the North Sea combine speed with seaworthiness, shallow draft with ocean-going capability, in ways that will prove revolutionary to maritime warfare. Imagine the largest of these vessels as she slides down wooden rollers into the dark waters of a secluded bay, her clinker-built hull gleaming with fresh tar, her dragon-head prow carving the surface like a living creature testing its element. 30 oars on each side will drive her through calms, while her single square sail can catch the slightest wind to carry her across open ocean at speeds that will astonish those who first witness her arrival on foreign shores. Most significantly, her shallow draft allows her to penetrate rivers and estuaries where no conventional ship can follow, bringing sudden destruction to settlements that have never considered maritime assault a possibility. The men who crew this revolutionary vessel represent the finest flowering of Norse warrior culture, though they remain unknown to the wider world that will soon learn to fear their approach. These are not desperate outcasts, driven by starvation to seek their fortunes across dangerous waters, but young men of good family who seek adventure and honor in the traditional manner of their people. Some are second sons who will inherit no land. Others are ambitious warriors who hope to win wealth enough to establish their own holdings. Still others are simply following the ancient call that has always drawn Norse youth to test themselves against the unknown dangers that lie beyond familiar horizons. Their target, chosen perhaps through information gathered by traders who frequent both Scandinavian and British waters, represents everything that makes Christian civilization vulnerable to the kind of warfare these Northmen are about to introduce. Lindisfarne rises from the tidal waters off the Northumbrian coast like a vision of otherworldly peace, its stone buildings housing a community of monks whose entire existence revolves around prayer, scholarship, and the preservation of learning that connects them to the wider Christian world. The monastery has prospered for more than a century under royal protection, accumulating treasures that reflect both pious donations and the skilled craftsmanship of generations of religious artists. Picture this island sanctuary as it appears on the morning of June 8, 793, when the first light of dawn illuminates walls that have never known the sound of war, revealing gardens where monks tend herbs and vegetables with the same devotion they bring to their spiritual exercises. The bell tower that calls the community to their canonical hours rises against a sky unmarked by the smoke of burning buildings, while the library that houses precious manuscripts collected from across the Christian world expects nothing more violent than the turning of illuminated pages by scholarly hands. The community that inhabits this peaceful refuge embodies everything that distinguishes Christian civilization from the pagan world that surrounds it, yet this very distinction will prove their vulnerability when confronted by enemies who operate according to entirely different moral frameworks. These are men who have renounced violence as incompatible with their spiritual calling, who possess no weapons beyond the farm tools they use to work their fields, who have placed their trust in divine protection and the secular authority of kings whose power seems distant from their daily concerns. Brother Higbold, who serves as prior of this holy community, rises before dawn to prepare for the service of Lords, his footsteps echoing through corridors where generations of his predecessors have walked in similar devotion. The manuscript he will read from during the morning office represents months of painstaking labor by monks whose artistry transforms sacred text into visual prayer, each letter carefully formed with inks that glow like jewels in the candlelight that illuminates their work. The golden chalice that will hold the sacramental wine reflects the generous donations of kings and nobles who seek spiritual benefit from supporting such holy enterprises. Yet, even as Brother Higbold prepares for morning prayer, the dragon ships that will shatter his community's peace cut through North Sea swells with the efficiency of predators closing on unwary prey. The wind that fills their striped sails carries them toward a destiny that will transform both attacker and victim in ways that neither can anticipate. The young warriors who grip their oars and weapons understand that they approach something more significant than a simple raid for treasure, though they cannot yet comprehend that they are about to trigger a transformation that will reshape the relationship between Christian and pagan Europe. The mist that rises from the sea as dawn approaches Lindisfarne provides perfect concealment for the approaching raiders, allowing them to draw within striking distance before any watcher on the island can discern the distinctive silhouettes that will soon become symbols of terror throughout Christian Europe. The dragon heads that crown their prow posts emerge from the grey vapors like creatures from nightmare, while the sound of their passage through the water whispers promises of violence to a community that has forgotten such possibilities exist. The moment of first contact unfolds with the terrible swiftness that will characterize Viking warfare throughout the coming centuries, as boats designed for surprise assault strike a target that has no conception of the military revolution about to engulf it. Picture the scene as the first longship grounds on Lindisfarne's sandy beach, her crew leaping over the gunwales with weapons already drawn, their war cries echoing across waters that have known only the gentle sounds of fishing boats and pilgrims seeking passage to this holy shrine. The monks who hear these alien sounds cannot immediately comprehend their significance, for nothing in their experience has prepared them for the reality of armed assault upon a sacred site. Some continue their preparations for morning prayer, assuming that the commotion outside their chapel represents nothing more threatening than an unusually large group of pilgrims arriving at an inconvenient hour. Others peer from their windows with curiosity rather than alarm, their scholarly minds seeking to categorize sounds that fall outside the familiar patterns of monastic life. The attack itself proceeds with the brutal efficiency that marks professional warriors operating against helpless civilians, yet even this violence carries elements that distinguish it from mere banditry. These raiders seek not only portable wealth, but objects of particular value that suggest familiarity with Christian culture and its treasures. The illuminated manuscripts that represent years of devoted labor attract their attention not merely as curiosities, but as items whose worth they can appreciate, while their treatment of religious vessels reveals understanding that such objects possess value beyond their simple material composition. Yet the psychological impact of this assault extends far beyond the immediate destruction it inflicts upon a single monastery, for the news that spreads across Christian Europe in the weeks following Lindisfarne's fall carries implications that challenge fundamental assumptions about divine protection and secular security. Here is proof that no Christian settlement, however remote or sacred, lies beyond the reach of pagan raiders, who possess both the naval technology and the cultural motivation to strike at targets previously considered invulnerable. These survivors who eventually reach the mainland carry with them more than reports of material loss and physical destruction. They bear witness to an encounter between two civilizations whose conflicting values will define the character of European development for centuries to come. The dragon ships that appeared from the morning mist and vanished back into northern waters represent more than a single raid. They herald the beginning of an age when Christian Europe must learn to defend itself against enemies whose very existence challenges the assumptions upon which medieval society has been constructed. As news of Lindisfarne's destruction spreads through the communication networks that connect Christian monasteries across Europe, scholars who have devoted their lives to preserving classical learning struggle to find precedents for what they are witnessing. The civilized world has not seen such maritime raiders since the collapse of Roman authority, and nothing in their historical knowledge prepares them for enemies who combine sophisticated seamanship with complete indifference to Christian moral restraints. The age that dawns with this single assault will test every assumption about security, civilization, and divine providence that has shaped European consciousness since the conversion of Constantine. The ripples that spread outward from Lindisfarne's burning buildings carry more than news of a single monastery's destruction, for they herald the emergence of a new form of warfare that will transform the relationship between land and sea throughout medieval Europe. The dragon ships that vanished into northern waters after completing their devastating work represent not an isolated incident, but the first visible manifestation of a cultural transformation that has been building within Scandinavian society for generations. What Christian chroniclers will record as the beginning of the Viking Age marks in reality the moment when Norse maritime supremacy reveals itself to a world that has forgotten such possibilities could exist. Picture the scene in Norwegian fjords during the months following that first successful raid, as news of Lindisfarne's wealth and vulnerability spreads through the network of kinship and alliance that connects scattered communities across the Scandinavian landscape. The gold and silver that the raiders carry home from their English adventure represents more than mere treasure. It constitutes proof that the wider world beyond their familiar horizons holds riches beyond anything their traditional economy can provide. Young men who had resigned themselves to lives of subsistence farming or dangerous fishing suddenly glimpsed possibilities that their fathers could never have imagined. The longships that made such possibilities real embody centuries of accumulated innovation by shipwrights whose genius has been shaped by the unique demands of Scandinavian waters. These vessels represent far more than mere transportation. They constitute the foundation upon which an entire civilization will build its expansion across medieval Europe. Their revolutionary design combines elements that conventional Mediterranean shipbuilding has never achieved. The shallow draft that allows them to penetrate rivers no Roman galley could navigate, the flexibility that enables them to ride out North Atlantic storms that would destroy more rigid craft, and the speed that makes surprise assault possible against targets that have never considered maritime threats. Imagine one of these masterpieces of naval architecture as she rests in a secluded cove between raids, her crew performing the meticulous maintenance that keeps her seaworthy through campaigns that would challenge any vessel ever built. The clinker construction that gives her strength allows her planks to move with the sea rather than fighting against it, while the single mast that carries her distinctive square sail can be lowered quickly when stealth demands approach under oar power alone. Most remarkably, her design permits beaching on any sandy shore, transforming every coastline into a potential landing point for forces that can strike without warning and withdraw before effective resistance can organize. The warriors who crew these revolutionary vessels represent a new breed of fighter, whose capabilities will confound every military tradition that medieval Europe has inherited from the classical world. These are not the heavily armored knights who will dominate later medieval warfare, nor the disciplined legions that once carried Roman standards to victory across 3 continents. Instead, they embody a fighting culture that combines individual skill with flexible tactics, personal courage with practical opportunism, in ways that prove devastatingly effective against opponents who fight according to more conventional principles. The raiding culture that emerges from this technological and tactical innovation operates according to patterns that reflect both the seasonal rhythms of Scandinavian agriculture and the strategic requirements of maritime warfare. Spring and summer become the seasons of the dragon ships, when favorable winds and lengthening days allow expeditions that can range across vast distances while still returning home before winter storms make North Sea navigation impossible. The young men who join these ventures understand that they embark upon more than simple piracy. They participate in a form of warfare that tests courage, skill, and luck in equal measure, while offering rewards that traditional Norse society cannot provide. Picture a typical raiding fleet as it assembles in the sheltered waters of a Danish fjord, each ship representing a different community's contribution to an enterprise that will benefit all participants according to carefully established customs governing the distribution of plunder. The chieftain who leads this expedition possesses authority that derives not from royal appointment, but from personal reputation earned through previous successes, while the warriors who follow him do so through choice rather than feudal obligation. This voluntary association creates bonds of loyalty that prove stronger than the conscripted armies that will oppose them, for each man understands that his survival depends upon the skill and courage of his companions. The targets these raiders select reveal sophisticated intelligence networks that extend far beyond the boundaries of their homeland, suggesting commercial and diplomatic contacts that Christian chroniclers rarely acknowledge in their accounts of heathen depredations. Monasteries attract particular attention not only because of their accumulated wealth, but because their location on islands or promontories makes them accessible to shallow draft vessels, while their populations possess no military capability that might threaten raiding parties. Trading centers offer different attractions, providing not only portable goods, but information about political conditions and defensive capabilities that guides future operations. The tactics employed in these assaults demonstrate adaptation to specific circumstances that marks professional military thinking rather than simple barbarian aggression. Each raid begins with careful reconnaissance that identifies the most vulnerable approaches, the location of valuable assets, and the probable response time of any military forces that might threaten the operation. The actual assault unfolds with coordinated precision that maximizes shock effect while minimizing exposure to counterattack, as raiders emerge simultaneously from concealment to overwhelm defenders before organized resistance can develop. Yet these warriors fight for more than immediate material gain, for their culture imbues warfare with spiritual significance that transforms every battle into a test of divine favor. The gods of their fathers smile upon courage displayed in combat, while cowardice earns eternal shame that no earthly success can erase. This religious dimension of Viking warfare creates fighters who welcome death in battle as the pathway to Valhalla, where Odin's chosen warriors feast and fight in preparation for the final cosmic struggle that will determine the fate of gods and men alike. The seasonal pattern of Viking raids creates rhythms of terror and relief that mark the passage of years throughout coastal Europe, as Christian communities learn to anticipate the arrival of dragon ships with each spring's warming winds. Monasteries that had operated for centuries without serious military precautions begin to construct defensive walls and establish lookout posts, while coastal towns organize militia forces whose effectiveness remains doubtful against enemies who can strike without warning and withdraw before local authorities can respond effectively. The economic impact of this new form of warfare extends far beyond the immediate losses suffered by individual communities, as trade routes that have operated safely for generations require new defensive measures that increase costs and reduce profits. Merchants who had moved freely along established coastal routes now travel in armed convoys or seek alternative inland passages that avoid the waters where dragon ships hunt their prey. The vibrant commercial networks that had begun to revive European prosperity in the centuries following Rome's collapse face disruption that threatens to reverse the gradual recovery from classical collapse. Yet the raiders themselves evolve beyond simple pillaging, as their success creates opportunities for more sophisticated forms of exploitation. Some Viking bands establish winter camps that allow extended campaigns lasting multiple seasons, while others negotiate tribute arrangements with local rulers who prefer paying protection money to facing repeated devastation. These developments mark the beginning of a transformation that will eventually see Viking raiders become Viking settlers, as the most successful warbands recognize that sustained exploitation of conquered territories offers greater rewards than periodic raids. The geographical range of Viking operations expands with each successful season, as improved intelligence and accumulated experience enable expeditions that venture ever farther from their Scandinavian bases. The Irish Sea becomes a Viking lake where Norse fleets operate with impunity, while the river systems of Europe provide highways that carry dragon ships hundreds of miles inland to strike at targets that had never considered maritime threats possible. From the Shetland Islands to the Mediterranean, from Ireland to Constantinople, the distinctive silhouettes of Norse vessels appear wherever Christian civilization has accumulated wealth worth taking. The cultural shock that accompanies these raids reflects more than simple fear of physical violence, for the Vikings represent everything that Christian Europe has struggled to transcend in its long journey from classical paganism to medieval Christianity. These are warriors who celebrate values that the Church has labored to suppress: the glorification of violence, the worship of pagan gods, the rejection of Christian mercy in favor of warrior honor. Their very existence challenges the assumption that Christianity has triumphed over the darkness of heathen barbarism, while their success suggests that divine providence may not protect the faithful as completely as church teaching proclaims. The technological superiority that enables Viking dominance at sea has no equivalent on land, where their relatively small numbers make them vulnerable to organized resistance by populations that outnumber them dramatically. This limitation shapes their strategic approach, encouraging hit-and-run tactics that avoid prolonged engagement with superior forces, while exploiting their maritime mobility to strike where enemies least expect attack. The dragon ships that make such tactics possible represent more than superior shipbuilding. They embody a complete military system based on speed, surprise, and the ability to withdraw from unfavorable situations. As the 8th century draws toward its close, the pattern of Viking raiding has established itself as a permanent feature of European political and military reality. The monasteries of Ireland bear witness to repeated devastation, while the kingdoms of England struggle with threats that their traditional military institutions cannot effectively counter. Across the continent, Christian rulers who had focused their defensive concerns on land-based enemies now confront seaborne raiders whose capabilities exceed anything their strategic planning has anticipated. The age of the dragon ships has begun, and its consequences will reshape European civilization in ways that none can yet imagine. The transformation that begins to unfold during the opening decades of the 9th century marks a fundamental shift in the relationship between the Northmen and the lands they have terrorized, as the practical realities of sustained warfare reveal opportunities that transcend the limited rewards of seasonal raiding. The dragon ships that had appeared each spring to strike and vanish now begin to linger in foreign waters, their crews establishing winter camps that evolve gradually into permanent settlements. What had begun as expeditions to gather portable wealth develops into something far more ambitious: the creation of Viking kingdoms that will endure for centuries while reshaping the political map of medieval Europe. Picture the scene along the Irish coast as the first of these transformations takes root, where the sheltered waters of Dublin Bay provide everything that Norse settlers require for establishing a permanent foothold in lands that had seemed suitable only for periodic exploitation. The broad estuary of the River Liffey offers access to Ireland's interior that shallow draft longships can navigate with ease, while the surrounding countryside provides agricultural resources sufficient to support a growing population of warriors and their families. Most significantly, the location commands trade routes that connect Ireland to the wider commercial networks of medieval Europe, transforming what had been a raiding base into the foundation of a maritime empire. The Vikings, who established this first substantial settlement beyond Scandinavia, bring with them more than weapons and ships, for they carry the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that has learned to prosper under the harsh conditions of their northern homeland. Their understanding of urban planning, maritime commerce, and military organization proves remarkably adaptable to the opportunities that Ireland presents, while their willingness to learn from local populations enables forms of cultural synthesis that conventional raid and retreat tactics could never achieve. A fortified settlement that emerges from these efforts represents something entirely new in European development: a hybrid culture that combines Norse military efficiency with Celtic artistic sensibility. Imagine walking through the streets of this nascent Viking Dublin as it takes shape during the early decades of the 9th century, where timber longhouses built in the Scandinavian style stand alongside structures that reflect Irish building traditions, their different architectural vocabularies creating a visual testament to the cultural fusion occurring within these defensive walls. The workshops that line these muddy thoroughfares produce goods that combine Norse metalworking techniques with Celtic decorative motifs, while the harbours echo with languages that blend Old Norse vocabulary with Irish pronunciation in ways that create entirely new forms of communication. The economic foundations that support this emerging settlement extend far beyond the traditional Viking reliance on raiding and tribute, as Dublin's strategic location enables its rulers to participate in trade networks that span the known world. The silver that flows into their coffers no longer comes primarily from monastery treasures, but from commercial ventures that connect Irish raw materials with markets in England, France, and even distant Byzantium. Slave trading, though morally reprehensible to modern sensibilities, provides a particularly lucrative source of revenue, as Viking merchants transport captives taken in raids across Ireland to buyers throughout Europe and the Islamic world. Yet Dublin represents only the most visible example of a transformation occurring wherever Viking raiders have discovered territories worth holding permanently. Along the coasts of England, similar settlements take root, as Norse warriors recognize that controlling territory offers greater long-term rewards than simply plundering it periodically. The city that will become York emerges from this process as another major center of Viking power. Its position on the River Ouse providing access to the rich agricultural lands of northern England, while its existing commercial infrastructure offers opportunities for expansion that raiding could never match. The evolution of these raiding bands into territorial rulers requires adaptation to political realities that differ fundamentally from the relatively simple leadership structures that had governed ship crews and seasonal expeditions. The successful Viking chieftain must now master the complexities of administering settled populations that include not only his original followers, but growing numbers of local inhabitants who submit to Norse rule for protection or opportunity. This transformation demands diplomatic skills alongside military prowess, as the maintenance of order requires balancing the competing interests of various ethnic and social groups within expanding territorial boundaries. Picture the great hall of a Viking ruler in this period of transition, where the atmosphere blends elements that reflect both Scandinavian tradition and local adaptation. The high seat that symbolizes royal authority follows Norse custom in its construction and placement, yet the ceremonies conducted within these walls incorporate elements borrowed from the Christian and Celtic cultures that surround this island of paganism. The warriors who gather for feasting and council include not only Norse veterans, but local fighters who have joined the Viking cause, their diverse backgrounds creating a cosmopolitan character that distinguishes these courts from the more homogeneous assemblies of traditional Scandinavian society. The administrative challenges that accompany territorial expansion force Viking rulers to develop governmental institutions that can function effectively across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The Thing assemblies that had regulated Norse society in Scandinavia prove adaptable to governing mixed populations, while local legal traditions contribute elements that enhance the flexibility and effectiveness of Viking administration. This synthesis creates legal systems that combine Norse emphasis on personal honor with local customs governing property rights and commercial transactions, producing hybrid institutions that prove remarkably durable and effective. The military requirements of defending permanent territories against both external enemies and internal rebellion drive innovations in Viking warfare that extend far beyond the ship-based tactics that had characterized their initial expansion. The construction of fortified settlements demands engineering skills that surpass anything required for temporary raiding camps, while the recruitment and training of local forces requires adaptation of Norse military traditions to accommodate fighters trained in different tactical systems. These developments mark the beginning of a transformation that will eventually see Viking armies evolving from mobile raiding bands into the foundations of territorial kingdoms. The cultural exchange that flourishes within these expanding Viking territories produces artistic and intellectual achievements that transcend anything possible under the limited contact that characterizes raid and retreat operations. The stone crosses that appear in areas of Viking settlement bear decorative motifs that blend Norse mythology with Christian symbolism, while the metalwork produced in Viking workshops demonstrates technical innovations that result from combining Scandinavian craftsmanship with local materials and traditions. These artistic syntheses create styles that influence development throughout medieval Europe, as trade networks carry Viking-inspired designs far beyond the boundaries of direct Norse political control. Perhaps nowhere does this transformation appear more dramatically than in the emergence of the Danelaw, that portion of England where Viking settlement creates a parallel civilization that coexists uneasily with Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the south. The boundaries established through Alfred the Great's treaty with Guthrum represent more than mere territorial division. They acknowledge the reality that Viking settlement has created communities whose legal, cultural, and economic systems operate according to principles fundamentally different from those governing traditional English society. Picture the landscape of the Danelaw as it develops during the late 9th and early 10th centuries, where place names ending in by and thorp mark the locations of Scandinavian settlements, their linguistic legacy preserving evidence of demographic transformation that continues to influence English geography more than a millennium later. The farmers who work these fields follow agricultural practices that blend Norse techniques with local conditions, while the craftsmen who supply their needs produce goods that reflect the hybrid culture emerging from this extraordinary historical experiment. The commercial networks that develop from these permanent settlements extend Viking influence far beyond the boundaries of direct political control, as Norse merchants establish trading posts along routes that connect Scandinavia with the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the river systems of Eastern Europe. The silver coins that archaeologists discover buried throughout the Viking world testify to commercial relationships that span continents, while the exotic goods found in Norse graves speak of trade connections that link the fjords of Norway with the bazaars of Baghdad and the workshops of Constantinople. The religious dimension of Viking settlement presents perhaps the greatest challenge to traditional Norse identity, as permanent residence in Christian lands creates pressures for conversion that temporary raiders never faced. Some Viking rulers embrace Christianity as a political necessity that eases relations with local populations and neighboring kingdoms, while others maintain traditional Norse paganism despite the diplomatic difficulties such commitment creates. This religious diversity within Viking territories produces theological experiments that influence both Christian and pagan traditions, as missionaries and traditional priests compete for the loyalty of populations caught between conflicting spiritual systems. The evolution of Viking raiders into territorial rulers represents one of medieval Europe's most remarkable transformations, as warriors who had originally sought nothing more than portable wealth discover that permanent settlement offers opportunities for power and influence that transcend anything achievable through traditional raiding. The kingdoms they establish will endure for centuries, leaving cultural and political legacies that continue to shape European development long after the dragon ships have disappeared from northern waters. Yet this transformation marks not the end of Viking expansion, but merely its evolution into new forms that will prove even more historically significant than the raids that first announced Norse presence to a startled Christian world. The lessons learned through decades of settlement and territorial administration coalesce during the middle years of the 9th century into something unprecedented in the annals of Viking warfare. A coordinated invasion force whose strategic vision extends far beyond the traditional goals of raiding and seasonal plunder. The scattered successes of individual warbands and the gradual establishment of trading settlements have revealed the true potential of English wealth and vulnerability, creating a shared understanding among Norse leaders that the time has come for conquest on a scale that will dwarf all previous Viking achievements. The army that assembles in the Danish islands during the summer of 865 represents the culmination of a generation's experience in territorial warfare, its leadership drawn from the most successful Viking rulers of the age. Picture the scene in the sheltered waters of Danish fjords as the greatest fleet in Viking history takes shape through the convergence of contingents from across the Scandinavian world, each ship representing a community's investment in an enterprise whose success will reshape the political balance of medieval European countries. The dragon heads that crown these vessels bear the scars of countless previous expeditions, while their crews include veterans whose experience spans every form of warfare that the Viking Age has yet produced. This is not a collection of independent raiding bands seeking individual profit, but a unified force whose commanders understand that English conquest requires coordination and discipline on an unprecedented scale. The leadership of this extraordinary expedition reflects the political evolution that has transformed Viking warfare from heroic adventure into strategic calculation, as rulers who have learned to govern settled territories apply their administrative skills to military planning. At the heart of this confederation stands the figure who will become known to history as Ivar the Boneless, a commander whose tactical genius has been shaped by years of campaigning that have taught him to view warfare as an extension of statecraft, rather than merely an expression of individual courage. His brothers, Ubva and Halfdan Ragnarsson, bring their own proven abilities to bear on an enterprise that demands every form of expertise that 3 generations of Viking expansion have developed. The army that these leaders command represents more than simple numerical superiority over previous Viking expeditions, for its composition reflects the sophisticated military organization that has evolved from decades of territorial warfare. Infantry units trained in siege techniques march alongside traditional ship crews, while cavalry forces demonstrate adaptation to forms of combat that purely maritime raiders had never required. Most significantly, the expedition includes specialists in fortification and administration, whose presence indicates intentions that extend far beyond temporary conquest toward permanent occupation of whatever territories their arms might win. The strategic planning that guides this invasion reveals understanding of English political weaknesses that surpasses anything demonstrated by previous Viking expeditions, as the Danish commanders recognize that the Heptarchy's division into competing kingdoms offers opportunities for systematic conquest that unified resistance could never permit. Rather than striking random targets as earlier raiders had done, they design a campaign that exploits the rivalries and mutual suspicions that prevent English rulers from coordinating effective defense against threats that endanger their common survival. East Anglia falls first to this methodical assault, its unfortunate King Edmund discovering that traditional English military institutions cannot cope with enemies who combine Norse tactical flexibility with the strategic vision that comes from governing territorial states. Picture the scene as Danish forces pour inland from their beachhead on the Norfolk coast, their advance marked not by the random destruction that had characterized earlier raids, but by the systematic occupation of administrative centers and communication nodes that will enable permanent control over conquered populations. The death of King Edmund, whether through battle wounds or the ritual execution that Norse sources describe, marks more than the fall of a single ruler. It symbolizes the collapse of an entire political system before forces it cannot comprehend or resist. The conquest of Northumbria unfolds with similar efficiency, as Danish armies exploit the civil war that has weakened this northern kingdom beyond any possibility of effective resistance. The puppet rulers who submit to Viking authority, in exchange for nominal independence, provide the invaders with legitimacy that earlier raiders could never achieve, while the tribute arrangements they negotiate ensure steady revenue streams that support continued military operations without requiring constant pillaging of productive agricultural regions. This combination of political sophistication with military efficiency marks a new phase in Viking development that transcends anything their predecessors had accomplished. Mercia's submission represents perhaps the greatest triumph of Danish strategic planning, as King Burgred's flight to Rome removes the last obstacle to Viking domination of central England, while providing the invaders with administrative structures they can adapt to their own purposes. The speed with which Danish forces penetrate to the heart of this ancient kingdom demonstrates the superiority of their military organization over English defensive systems that have been designed primarily to resist raids rather than systematic conquest. Each victory reinforces the psychological advantages that favor the invaders, as English resistance crumbles before enemies whose success seems to prove divine favor for their cause. Yet the ultimate test of Danish ambitions awaits in Wessex, where King Alfred represents everything that distinguishes successful medieval kingship from mere aristocratic leadership. This young ruler, whose education has encompassed both military and scholarly pursuits, possesses understanding of strategic principles that enables him to recognize the true nature of the threat facing English independence. Unlike his predecessors who had treated Viking raids as temporary inconveniences to be endured rather than systematic challenges requiring fundamental changes in defensive strategy, Alfred understands that survival demands transformation of traditional English military institutions to meet enemies who fight according to entirely different principles. The Danish invasion of Wessex unfolds across landscapes that have witnessed centuries of English resistance to foreign invasion, yet the tactics that had once proven effective against earlier enemies prove inadequate against raiders who possess both superior mobility and strategic vision that extends beyond immediate battlefield success. Alfred's early defeats teach him hard lessons about the realities of warfare against enemies who can concentrate forces rapidly through their control of river transportation, while withdrawing before English armies can pin them down for decisive engagement. These painful experiences force innovations in English military organization that will ultimately prove decisive, though their effectiveness becomes apparent only through years of patient development. Picture the scene at the Battle of Edington as it unfolds across the rolling downs of Wiltshire, where the military lessons of a generation's warfare reach their climactic test in a confrontation that will determine whether English independence can survive the Viking onslaught. Alfred's forces represent the culmination of his efforts to create military institutions capable of matching Danish tactical flexibility with English demographic advantages, while his opponents embody the finest traditions of Viking warfare refined through years of successful campaigning. The outcome of this engagement will determine not only the immediate fate of Wessex, but the entire future trajectory of English political development. The victory that Alfred achieves at Edington results not from any single tactical innovation, but from the successful integration of multiple military reforms that collectively enable English forces to compete effectively with Viking armies, for the first time since the Great Army's arrival. The defensive burhs that have provided secure bases for English operations prove their worth, while the reorganized fur demonstrates that English infantry can match Danish warriors when properly led and equipped. Most significantly, Alfred's use of coordinated cavalry forces shows that he has learned to fight Vikings using their own tactical principles, rather than simply relying on traditional English military methods. The treaty negotiations that follow Edington's English victory reveal the extent to which prolonged warfare has transformed both sides, as Alfred and Guthrum recognize that neither can achieve complete victory over the other without costs that would exhaust their respective kingdoms. The agreement they reach at Wedmore represents more than simple territorial division. It acknowledges the reality that Viking settlement has created a parallel civilization within England that cannot be eliminated through military force alone. The religious dimension of this settlement, marked by Guthrum's conversion to Christianity, symbolizes the beginning of a cultural synthesis that will eventually produce the unified English kingdom of the 10th century. The baptism of Guthrum at Ayla represents one of the most significant moments in the entire Viking Age, as this powerful Danish ruler becomes the first major Viking leader to embrace Christianity, not merely as political expedient, but as genuine religious conviction. Picture the scene as this weathered warrior, whose hands have held weapons in countless battles, submits to the ritual waters that symbolize rebirth into a faith his ancestors would have considered alien to their essential nature. Alfred's role as godfather to his former enemy demonstrates the diplomatic wisdom that has enabled Wessex to survive when other English kingdoms have fallen, while Guthrum's acceptance of Christian kingship marks the beginning of a transformation that will eventually see Viking rulers throughout Europe following similar paths. The cultural implications of this religious conversion extend far beyond mere political accommodation, as Christian kingship requires forms of legitimacy and administrative organization that differ fundamentally from traditional Norse leadership patterns. Guthrum's subjects watch their ruler embrace ceremonies and symbols that represent submission to divine authority that transcends earthly power, while English observers witness the extraordinary spectacle of Viking warriors accepting baptism alongside their chieftain. This mass conversion marks not the abandonment of Norse identity, but its adaptation to circumstances that require new forms of cultural expression, while preserving essential elements of Scandinavian tradition. The Great Army's campaigns establish Viking territorial control throughout northern and eastern England, while demonstrating that sustained conquest requires military capabilities and political vision that transcend anything achievable through traditional raiding. The kingdoms they establish will endure for generations, their legal and cultural institutions contributing elements to English development that survive long after political independence ends. Yet their greatest achievement may be forcing English innovation that creates the unified kingdom Alfred's successors will forge from the defensive institutions he has established to resist their advance. While the Great Army consolidates its conquests across the breadth of England, and Viking settlers carve out kingdoms from territories that had never known Scandinavian rule, other currents within Norse civilization flow toward horizons that lie beyond any lands yet touched by European exploration. The restless energy that drives Viking expansion seeks outlets in every direction that maritime technology can reach. Yet, the Western seas hold particular appeal for those whose spirits cannot find satisfaction in the familiar patterns of raid and settlement that have brought such success to their kinsmen. These waters stretch toward the edge of the known world, where ancient stories speak of lands wrapped in perpetual mist and islands that appear only to those whom fate has chosen for discovery. Picture the scene in Norwegian fjords during the late 9th century, as a new generation of explorers prepares for voyages that will extend Viking presence far beyond the boundaries that have contained European civilization since its earliest beginnings. The ships that ride at anchor in these sheltered harbors differ subtly from their cousins designed for warfare and coastal raiding, their broader beams and deeper holds reflecting adaptation to the requirements of oceanic exploration and long-distance colonization. These are vessels built to carry not only warriors, but entire communities across waters so vast that return voyages may prove impossible, their holds packed with livestock, farming tools, and household goods that represent the accumulated wealth of families willing to stake everything on the promise of new lands beyond the western horizon. The men and women who commit themselves to such enterprises represent a particular strain within Viking society, those whose temperament finds the constraints of settled civilization incompatible with their essential nature. They are not refugees fleeing political persecution or economic hardship, but seekers driven by the same restless curiosity that has always characterized the Norse relationship with the unknown. Their leader in this westward movement emerges as a figure whose very name will become synonymous with discovery, Erik Thorvaldsson, known to history as Erik the Red, whose exile from Iceland for manslaughter provides the catalyst for exploration that will carry Viking civilization to the very shores of the North American continent. The Iceland that Erik leaves behind in 982 represents one of the most remarkable achievements in the entire history of human colonization, a success story that demonstrates Viking capability for adaptation to environments that challenge every aspect of traditional Scandinavian life. Picture this island as the first Norse settlers had found it barely a century earlier, a landscape of fire and ice, where volcanic peaks pierce glacial caps, where geysers shoot boiling water towards skies that remain bright through the brief Arctic summer and dark through the endless winter months. No human populations had ever established permanent residence in this harsh environment. Yet within generations of their arrival, Norse colonists have created a civilization that rivals anything achieved in the more temperate regions of their expanding world. The Althing that governs this remarkable society represents perhaps the highest development of traditional Norse political institutions, a parliamentary assembly that demonstrates how democratic principles can function effectively in communities that lack the hierarchical structures characteristic of European kingship. Picture the annual gathering at Thingvellir, where representatives from every settled region of Iceland converge to debate laws, settle disputes, and make collective decisions that will govern their isolated civilization through another year of survival in one of the world's most challenging environments. The law rock that serves as the focal point for these proceedings has witnessed the development of legal codes that combine traditional Scandinavian custom with innovations required by their unique circumstances. Yet, Erik's restless spirit finds even this extraordinary achievement insufficient to contain his ambitions, as his temperament drives him toward challenges that promise greater adventure than the increasingly civilized society of Iceland can provide. The manslaughter that forces his exile provides the external pressure necessary to transform private inclination into public action, as his 3-year banishment creates opportunity for exploration that internal motivation alone might never have achieved. The ships that accompany him into the western waters carry not only the household goods necessary for survival, but the accumulated knowledge of generations who have learned to establish civilization in previously uninhabitable environments. The land that Erik discovers beyond Iceland's western horizon presents challenges that dwarf even those overcome by Iceland's colonists, yet his genius for promotion transforms apparent obstacles into attractive opportunities through the simple expedient of naming his discovery Greenland. This masterstroke of medieval marketing demonstrates understanding of human psychology that enables him to recruit colonists for an enterprise that honest description would render impossible, as few families would voluntarily transplant themselves to territories whose climate makes Iceland seem temperate by comparison. Yet the name suggests possibilities that capture imaginations hungry for new opportunities, while Erik's own success in establishing a viable settlement provides practical proof that human determination can overcome apparently insurmountable natural obstacles. Picture the first Greenland settlements as they take shape along the fjords of what will become known as the Eastern Settlement, where Erik's colonists demonstrate once again the remarkable Viking capacity for adaptation to extreme environments. The farms they establish follow patterns developed in Iceland, but modified to accommodate conditions that push the boundaries of what medieval agriculture can achieve, while their construction techniques blend traditional Scandinavian building methods with innovations required by climate and available materials. The churches that rise among their secular buildings mark the Christianization that has gradually transformed Viking society, yet their architectural forms preserve elements that connect these isolated communities to the broader cultural heritage of their Scandinavian homeland. The society that develops in these remote settlements represents the culmination of Viking colonization techniques, refined through generations of experience in establishing civilization beyond the boundaries of the known world. The population that Erik assembles for his venture includes not only warriors and farmers, but craftsmen whose skills prove essential for survival in environments where every tool and weapon must be manufactured from locally available materials. The knowledge they bring encompasses everything from shipbuilding and metalworking to the agricultural and hunting techniques that make permanent settlement possible in regions where European civilization has never before taken root. Yet Greenland's most significant contribution to human history emerges through the explorations it enables rather than the settlements it supports, as the Viking presence in these western waters creates launching points for voyages that will carry European civilization to continents whose very existence remains unknown to the geographical knowledge of medieval European landscape. The son of Erik the Red inherits not only his father's skill in navigation, but his willingness to venture beyond established boundaries in search of opportunities that conventional wisdom insists cannot exist. Leif Erikson's westward voyage around the year 1000 represents the culmination of centuries of Viking exploration, carrying European maritime technology to its ultimate geographical extension. The land that Leif discovers beyond Greenland's western waters offers everything that the harsh environments of Iceland and Greenland deny to Norse colonization. Forests that provide unlimited timber for construction and shipbuilding, rivers thick with salmon and other fish, grasslands capable of supporting larger herds than the Arctic territories can sustain. The abundance that greets his exploration party suggests possibilities for expansion that could dwarf every previous Viking achievement, Yet the very richness of this new world conceals challenges that will prove more formidable than any natural obstacles the Norse have previously overcome. Picture the scene as Leif's party establishes the temporary settlement they call Leifsburdir, their activities marking the first European presence on the North American continent and initiating contact between civilizations whose development has proceeded along entirely separate trajectories for thousands of years. The longhouses they construct follow familiar Scandinavian patterns, adapted to local materials and conditions, while their exploration of surrounding territories reveals resources that exceed the most optimistic expectations of medieval European colonization. Yet something in the atmosphere of this new world suggests that their presence here represents not permanent expansion, but temporary intrusion into territories that belong to others, with prior claims and superior numbers. The native populations that the Vikings encounter in this new world possess capabilities that challenge every assumption about the relationship between European civilization and indigenous peoples that has shaped previous Norse expansion. These are not the scattered Celtic populations that had offered minimal resistance to Viking settlement in the Atlantic Islands, but organized societies whose military capabilities and demographic strength make Viking colonization impossible without accommodation that the Norse cultural framework cannot accommodate. The Skraelings, as the Vikings call these people, represent the first indigenous population that European expansion cannot simply overwhelm through superior military technology and organizational skills. The conflicts that develop between Norse colonists and native populations reveal the limitations of Viking expansion techniques when applied to territories where indigenous peoples possess both the numbers and the organization necessary for effective resistance. The battles fought around the Viking settlements demonstrate that European military advantages, while significant in individual encounters, cannot overcome the strategic disadvantages that flow from operating in hostile territory with extended supply lines and minimal reinforcement possibilities. Each Viking victory proves costly beyond replacement capabilities, while native losses can be sustained indefinitely by populations whose resources dwarf anything the Greenland settlements can provide. The abandonment of the Vinland settlements represents one of the most significant might-have-beens in human history, as Viking withdrawal from North America delays European colonization of the continent by nearly 5 centuries. The factors that force this retreat illuminate the practical limitations that constrain even the most successful expansion in human history, as distance from supporting populations, hostile indigenous resistance, and the simple economics of colonial maintenance prove insurmountable obstacles to permanent settlement. The families who return to Greenland carry with them memories of opportunities that surpass anything available in the harsh environments of the Arctic settlements, yet these very opportunities prove impossible to exploit given the resources and technologies available to medieval civilization. The legacy of these westward voyages extends far beyond their immediate practical results, as the geographical knowledge they generate and the technique they developed contribute to the broader expansion of European maritime capabilities that will eventually enable the Age of Exploration. The navigational skills that carry Viking ships across the North Atlantic represent the culmination of centuries of accumulated experience in oceanic navigation, while the colonization techniques they develop provide models for later European settlement efforts in distant territories. Yet their greatest achievement may be demonstrating that human determination and technological innovation can overcome natural obstacles that seem to exceed the boundaries of possibility, even when political and demographic realities ultimately frustrate the ambitions that drive such remarkable enterprises. While the westward voyages of Leif Erikson and his successors reveal the ultimate geographical boundaries of Viking expansion, discovering limits that even their remarkable maritime technology cannot overcome, the political energy of Norse civilization finds expression through a different form of empire building that transforms the established kingdoms of medieval Europe rather than seeking virgin territories beyond the known world. The lessons learned through 2 centuries of raid, settlement, and territorial conquest coalesced during the early decades of the 11th century into a vision of Nordic dominance that encompasses not scattered colonies, but the heartland of European civilization itself. Picture the scene in Danish royal halls during the final years of the 10th century, where advisors to King Svein Forkbeard contemplate opportunities that dwarf the achievements of all previous Viking rulers. The England that had once seemed unconquerable behind Alfred's defensive innovations now presents vulnerabilities that systematic Danish pressure can exploit, while the wealth accumulated through generations of successful trade and tribute provides resources sufficient to support campaigns on an unprecedented scale. The political fragmentation that plagues English royal succession creates openings for intervention that earlier Danish rulers could never have imagined, as competing claimants seek foreign support for domestic ambitions. The strategy that emerges from these Danish deliberations reflects the accumulated wisdom of generations who have learned that permanent conquest requires not only military victory, but political legitimacy that can survive the death of individual rulers. Rather than seeking to impose Norse institutions upon unwilling populations, as earlier Vikings had attempted, Sven and his advisors recognized that lasting power demands acceptance of local customs and expectations that define legitimate kingship in Christian Europe. This sophisticated understanding of political dynamics enables Danish rulers to present themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as rightful claimants to English thrones that inheritance and election can justify. The invasion that Svein launches against England in 1013 demonstrates how thoroughly Viking warfare has evolved from the opportunistic raiding that had characterized earlier generations. As his forces combine traditional Norse tactical advantages with strategic planning that reflects decades of experience in territorial administration, the army that accompanies him across the North Sea includes not only Danish veterans, but English exiles, whose knowledge of local conditions enables operations that strike precisely at the weaknesses that divide Ethelred's kingdom against itself. The speed with which English resistance collapses before this assault reveals how completely the political foundations of Anglo-Saxon kingship have eroded through years of unsuccessful resistance to Viking pressure. Yet Svein's early death transforms what might have been straightforward conquest into the more complex process that brings his son Canute to the English throne, through means that combine inheritance, election, and military force in ways that establish precedents for legitimate rule that transcend simple conquest. Picture the young Danish prince as he navigates the treacherous currents of English politics during the succession crisis that follows his father's death, his survival dependent upon demonstrating that Norse kingship can serve English interests more effectively than the native dynasties that have failed to provide adequate defense against foreign threats. The Canute who emerges from this political crucible represents a new breed of Viking ruler whose vision encompasses not merely Scandinavian expansion, but the creation of a maritime empire that unites the entire North Sea basin under Danish leadership. His conquest of England provides the foundation for ambitions that extend to Norway and the Baltic territories, where Swedish expansion has created opportunities for intervention that promise to bring all of Scandinavia under unified control for the first time in recorded history. The resources that English wealth provides enable military operations on a scale that previous Norse rulers could never have contemplated, while the legitimacy that comes from recognized kingship offers diplomatic advantages that mere war leaders cannot achieve. The North Sea Empire that Canute constructs during his remarkable reign represents the culmination of 3 centuries of Viking political evolution, demonstrating how completely Norse civilization has adapted to the requirements of governing settled territories, rather than simply exploiting them through raid and tribute. Picture his royal household as it moves between England, Denmark, and Norway, its cosmopolitan character reflecting the cultural synthesis that has transformed Viking courts from warrior assemblies into centers of learning and administration that rival anything achieved by traditional European monarchies. The advisors who served this remarkable king include not only Norse veterans but English clerks, Irish scholars, and continental diplomats whose diverse expertise enables governmental innovations that anticipate later medieval developments. The administrative systems that sustain Canute's empire demonstrate how thoroughly Viking rulers have mastered the complexities of governing multiple territories whose legal traditions, economic structures, and cultural expectations differ fundamentally from one another. English law continues to operate alongside Danish custom, while Norwegian regional autonomy coexists with royal authority that emanates from distant capitals. This federal approach to imperial administration enables Canute to maintain control over vast territories, without requiring the massive military occupation that would exhaust even English resources, as local elites discover that cooperation with Danish authority serves their interests more effectively than futile resistance. Yet the most remarkable aspect of Canute's achievement involves the transformation of Viking military culture from an instrument of conquest into a force for maintaining international order that serves the interests of Christian civilization as well as Nordic ambition. The English navy, that had once struggled ineffectively against Danish raiders, now patrols under Canute's authority to suppress piracy and protect commercial shipping throughout northern waters, while Danish armies that had terrorized monasteries provide security for pilgrims and merchants whose activities contribute to the prosperity that sustains imperial administration. This reversal of traditional relationships demonstrates how completely successful conquest can transform both conqueror and conquered through the practical necessities of effective governance. The economic integration that accompanies political unification creates commercial networks that span the northern world, connecting English agriculture with Danish timber, Norwegian fish with Swedish iron, in trading relationships that generate wealth exceeding anything achievable through traditional raiding and tribute. Picture the harbour of London during Canute's reign, where ships bearing the merchandise of a dozen nations converge under the protection of Danish naval power, their mixed crews speaking languages that reflect the cosmopolitan character of empire that transcends tribal boundaries. The silver that flows through these commercial channels enables construction projects and artistic patronage that rival the achievements of any contemporary monarchy. Meanwhile, in territories that lie beyond the direct reach of Canute's North Sea Empire, other streams of Viking expansion create parallel developments that extend north influence across distances that dwarf even the remarkable geographical scope of Danish imperial administration. The river systems of Eastern Europe provide highways that carry Swedish adventurers deep into continental territories where no previous Scandinavian influence has penetrated, creating trade routes that connect the Baltic with the Black Sea through commercial networks that span half the known world. The Varangians who establish these eastern connections represent a different tradition within Viking culture, one that emphasizes commercial opportunity over territorial conquest while maintaining the military capabilities that enable survival in hostile environments. Picture these Swedish merchants as they navigate the treacherous rapids of the Dnieper River, their ships laden with northern furs and amber that will purchase Byzantine silks and spices in markets where Norse goods command premium prices. The trading posts they establish along these routes become centers of cultural exchange that introduce Scandinavian influences into Slavic territories while carrying Eastern luxuries back to markets in Sweden and Denmark. The ultimate destination of these Eastern trade routes lies in Constantinople itself, where the Varangian god serves as the Byzantine emperor's personal bodyguard while maintaining connections to their Scandinavian homeland that enable commercial relationships spanning the breadth of Europe. These elite warriors, recruited from the finest Norse fighters, demonstrate how completely Viking military culture has adapted to the requirements of civilized warfare, as their service to Christian emperors requires tactical innovations that combine traditional Scandinavian fighting techniques with Byzantine strategic doctrine. The wealth they accumulate through imperial service flows back to Scandinavia through channels that enrich the entire Norse world. Picture the Great Palace of Constantinople during the height of Varangian influence, where Norse warriors stand guard over the heir of Caesar while maintaining cultural traditions that connect them to fjords and forests thousands of miles from the Mediterranean sun. Their presence in this ancient capital represents the furthest extension of Viking expansion, demonstrating how Norse adaptability enabled survival and prosperity in environments that differ completely from their ancestral homeland. The weapons they carry bear runic inscriptions that invoke the protection of Odin and Thor, yet their loyalty serves Christian emperors whose authority derives from entirely different religious and political traditions. The trade networks that connect these Eastern Varangians with their Western kinsmen create commercial relationships that span continents, carrying goods and ideas across distances that challenge the transportation capabilities of medieval technology. The routes they establish become permanent features of European commerce, carrying not only material goods but cultural influences that enrich both Scandinavian and Slavic civilizations. The archaeological evidence of these connections appears in hordes of Byzantine coins discovered throughout Sweden and Norway, tangible proof of commercial relationships that transformed the economy of the entire northern world. Yet the greatest achievement of this remarkable period involves the demonstration that Viking civilization has evolved beyond its origins as a warrior culture to become a force for integration and development that serves the interests of European civilization as a whole. The empire that Canute governs provides security and prosperity that enables achievements in art, literature, and learning that rival the accomplishments of any contemporary monarchy, while the commercial networks that connect all parts of the Viking world create wealth that supports cultural developments throughout Scandinavia. As raiders who had once terrorized Christian Europe have become the architects of political and economic systems that anticipate the unified kingdoms of later medieval development. The peak of Viking political power represents more than military achievement or commercial success. It demonstrates how completely a civilization can transform itself, while preserving essential cultural elements that define its continuing identity. The empire that spans the North Sea embodies the successful synthesis of Norse tradition with European innovation, creating institutions that serve both Scandinavian ambition and Christian civilization, while pointing toward forms of political organization that transcend the tribal boundaries of earlier medieval society. The magnificent empire that Canute constructs across the northern seas contains within its very success the seeds of its own dissolution, for the political unity that his genius creates depends upon personal authority that no institution can preserve beyond the grave of its architect. The death of this remarkable ruler in 1035 removes the only force capable of holding together territories whose natural allegiances pull toward the separate identities that imperial administration has temporarily suppressed. Yet from the fragments of Canute's shattered empire emerges a figure whose career will embody both the ultimate expression of Viking ambition and its final transformation into something that transcends the limitations of traditional Norse kingship. Picture the scene in Norwegian royal halls during the succession crisis that follows Canute's death, where the young prince, who will become known to history as Harald Hardrada, learns the harsh lessons that prepare him for a career spanning 3 decades of warfare across the breadth of medieval Europe. Born Harald Sigurdsson, this son of a minor Norwegian king possesses the restless energy and tactical brilliance that mark the greatest products of Viking civilization, yet circumstances deny him the inheritance that birth might normally provide. The political fragmentation that tears apart Canute's empire forces him to seek his fortune through the traditional paths of Viking advancement, exile, adventure, and the accumulation of wealth sufficient to purchase the loyalty necessary for royal ambition. The battle that drives Harald into exile unfolds at Stiklestad in 1030, where his half-brother Olaf's attempt to reclaim the Norwegian throne ends in defeat and death that scatter their supporters across the northern world. This catastrophe transforms a 15-year-old prince into a refugee whose survival depends upon the same qualities of courage and cunning that have enabled Viking expansion for 3 centuries. Yet the disaster that destroys his immediate prospects creates opportunities for the kind of adventure that shapes legendary careers, as exile forces him to seek his fortune in distant lands, where Norwegian dynastic politics cannot constrain his ambitions. The journey that carries Harald eastward through the river systems of Russia represents more than simple flight from political enemies, for it follows trade routes that connect Scandinavia with the wealthiest territories of medieval Europe. Picture this remarkable young man as he navigates the treacherous rapids of the Dnieper, his small band of followers representing all that remains of royal pretensions that once seemed destined for Norwegian throne rooms. The skills they possess encompass everything from seamanship and warfare to the diplomatic arts necessary for survival among populations whose languages and customs differ completely from anything in their Scandinavian experience. The Kiev that welcomes these Norwegian exiles represents one of the most sophisticated urban centers in medieval Europe, its prosperity built upon the commercial networks that connect Scandinavian raw materials with Byzantine luxury goods through trading relationships that span continents. The court of Yaroslav the Wise provides refuge for political exiles from across the northern world, its cosmopolitan character reflecting the cultural synthesis that characterizes successful medieval kingdoms. Here, Harald learns lessons in statecraft that complement his military education, while his growing reputation as a warrior opens opportunities for advancement that purely political connections could never provide. Yet the ultimate destination of Harald's Eastern Odyssey lies not in the river cities of Russia, but in Constantinople itself, where the Varangian Guard offers careers to Norse warriors whose abilities can serve Byzantine imperial interests. Picture the Great Palace as Harald first encounters it around 1035, its marble halls echoing with languages from across the known world, while its ceremonies blend Christian ritual with imperial traditions that reach back through centuries to the Roman Empire itself. The transformation from Norwegian exile to Byzantine officer requires adaptation to military and political systems that operate according to principles fundamentally different from anything in Scandinavian tradition. The campaigns that establish Harald's reputation within Byzantine service carry him across territories that span from the Caucasus Mountains to the deserts of Syria, each expedition providing lessons in warfare that transcend anything available through purely Scandinavian experience. His service under Emperor Michael IV demonstrates tactical innovations that combine Norse individual fighting skills with Byzantine strategic doctrine, creating hybrid military systems that prove devastatingly effective against enemies who expect either traditional Roman discipline or barbarian warrior fury, but not their sophisticated combination. Picture Harald as he leads Varangian forces through the narrow passes of the Georgian mountains, his men wielding battle axes, whose design recalls their Scandinavian origins, while their tactics reflect the disciplined coordination that Byzantine training has imposed upon traditional Norse warrior culture. The wealth that flows from these successful campaigns exceeds anything that Norwegian kingship could provide, as imperial service offers opportunities for enrichment that dwarf the limited resources available through traditional Scandinavian raiding and tribute. Each victory adds to accumulations that will eventually provide the foundation for royal ambitions that seemed permanently frustrated by his early exile. The diplomatic missions that complement Harald's military service provide education in international politics that proves equally valuable for future royal aspirations, as his negotiations with Arab emirs and Bulgarian princes demonstrate the complex relationships that govern medieval European affairs. The cultural sophistication that these experiences provide transforms the exiled Norwegian prince into something unprecedented in Viking tradition, a ruler whose understanding encompasses not only Scandinavian warrior culture, but the administrative and diplomatic skills necessary for governing in the broader context of European civilization. The wealth that Harald accumulates during his Byzantine service becomes legendary throughout the medieval world. Its magnitude suggesting divine favor that validates royal pretensions while providing practical resources necessary for the military campaigns that will restore Norwegian independence. The treasure ships that carry his accumulated fortune northward through the familiar river routes represent more than simple commercial success. They embody the transformation of Viking expansion from territorial conquest to individual achievement that transcends the limitations of traditional Norse society. The return to Scandinavia that Harald accomplishes in 1045 marks the beginning of a Norwegian royal career that demonstrates how completely Viking kingship has evolved from the warrior leadership of earlier generations toward forms of monarchy that anticipate later medieval developments. Picture his arrival in Norwegian waters after 15 years of exile, his fleet carrying not only accumulated wealth, but veterans whose experience spans campaigns from the Arctic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. The political situation that greets his return offers opportunities for intervention that his Byzantine education has prepared him to exploit with unprecedented sophistication. The agreement that Harald negotiates with Magnus the Good demonstrates diplomatic skills that earlier Norwegian rulers could never have achieved, as their power-sharing arrangement enables both kings to pursue separate ambitions without the civil warfare that had traditionally characterized Scandinavian dynastic disputes. This peaceful resolution of competing claims provides stability that allows Norwegian resources to support foreign ventures, rather than consuming themselves through internal conflict, while Harald's growing influence prepares the way for unified kingship that will follow Magnus's death in 1047. The reign that Harald enjoys as sole king of Norway from 1047 to 1066 represents the culmination of Viking political development, demonstrating how completely Norse civilization has adapted to the requirements of governing settled territories, while maintaining the military capabilities that enable continued expansion. The administrative systems he establishes combine Byzantine efficiency with Scandinavian legal traditions, creating governmental institutions that serve Norwegian interests while reflecting the cosmopolitan influences that his eastern adventures have provided. The wealth that his treasure rooms contain enables artistic patronage and architectural projects that rival anything achieved by contemporary European monarchies. Yet the ultimate test of Harald's transformed Viking kingship awaits across the North Sea, where English succession crises create opportunities for intervention that promise to restore Norwegian influence to territories that had slipped from Scandinavian control following Canute's death. The invasion that Harald plans for 1066 represents more than simple territorial ambition. It embodies the last great expression of Viking expansion, combining traditional Norse military capabilities with strategic vision that reflects 3 centuries of accumulated experience in conquest and administration. Picture the fleet that assembles in Norwegian fjords during the summer of 1066. Its 300 ships representing the largest invasion force that any Viking ruler has ever directed against a single target. The army that these vessels carry includes not only Norwegian veterans, but Danish allies, whose participation demonstrates that Scandinavian unity remains possible when sufficient opportunities justify cooperation. Most significantly, the expedition includes English exiles whose knowledge of local conditions enables tactical planning that earlier Norwegian invasions could never have achieved. The campaign that unfolds across the familiar landscapes of northern England demonstrates both the continued effectiveness of Viking military methods and the limitations that constrain their application against opponents who have learned to counter traditional Norse advantages. The initial success that Harald achieves at Fulford Gate proves that English armies remain vulnerable to Viking tactical innovation, while his occupation of York demonstrates that Scandinavian forces retain the capability for rapid territorial conquest when properly organized and led. Yet the catastrophe that befalls Harald's expedition at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, marks more than the death of a single king or the failure of a particular invasion. Picture the scene as this remarkable ruler, falls beneath English weapons on ground that has witnessed centuries of conflict between Saxon and Viking, his death symbolizing the end of an age when Scandinavian military superiority could challenge the established kingdoms of medieval Europe. The thunderbolt of the North lies silent on Yorkshire fields, his extraordinary career spanning from Byzantine palaces to Norwegian throne rooms, reaching its conclusion in a battle that closes forever the age of Viking expansion. The army that dies with Harald at Stamford Bridge represents the finest flowering of Viking military culture, its destruction marking the end of Nordic capabilities that had dominated European warfare for 3 centuries. The survivors who returned to Norway in barely 24 ships from the 300 that had carried such confident hopes across the North Sea bear witness to transformation that extends far beyond military defeat to encompass the closing of an entire chapter in European development. The age of the dragon ships has ended, and with it, the Viking dream of Northern Empire that had reshaped medieval civilization through the sheer force of Scandinavian ambition. The news that travels northward from the battlefield of Stamford Bridge carries more than tidings of a single king's death, for it announces the end of possibilities that have shaped Scandinavian ambition for 3 centuries, while ushering in transformations that will remake Viking civilization beyond all recognition. The ships that limp back to Norwegian fjords with their cargo of survivors and sorrow bear witness to changes that extend far beyond military defeat, to encompass the complete reorientation of Norse society toward new forms of power and different sources of legitimacy. The dragon heads that once carved through foreign waters with such confidence now return as emblems of an age whose time has passed, their symbolic authority diminished by the reality that European kingdoms have learned to resist Viking expansion through methods that traditional Norse warfare cannot overcome. Picture the scene in royal halls throughout Scandinavia, as word spreads of Harald's catastrophic defeat, its implications reverberating through communities that have built their entire social structure around the assumption that Viking military superiority provides eternal advantages over foreign enemies. The wealth that had flowed into Scandinavian treasuries through 3 centuries of successful raiding and conquest no longer seems assured, while the young men who had expected to follow their fathers' paths to glory and riches across the sea now face futures that offer no such opportunities for advancement. The transformation that begins in these months of mourning and reassessment will prove more thorough than any military conquest could achieve, as Viking society adapts to realities that require fundamental changes in values, institutions, and cultural identity. The Christian missions that had struggled for generations to establish permanent influence within Scandinavian territories discover that military defeat creates opportunities for religious conversion that previous evangelization efforts could never have achieved. The gods who had promised victory to their faithful warriors now appear to have abandoned their people in favor of the Christian deity whose protection has enabled English triumph over seemingly invincible Viking forces. The psychological impact of this apparent divine judgment provides Christian missionaries with arguments that transcend theological disputation to address the practical concerns of populations seeking new sources of supernatural protection. Picture the scene in Norwegian churches during the decades following Stamford Bridge, where congregations that had previously divided their loyalties between Christ and Odin now embrace Christianity with the fervor of converts who recognize that their traditional gods have failed to provide the victories that validate divine authority. The wooden stave churches that rise throughout Scandinavia during this period reflect architectural traditions that blend Norse construction techniques with Christian symbolic requirements, their dragon head decorations transformed from pagan symbols into representations of evil defeated by divine power. The cultural synthesis that emerges from this religious transformation preserves elements of traditional Viking identity, while redirecting them toward purposes that serve Christian rather than pagan objectives. The political implications of widespread Christianization extend far beyond religious observance to encompass fundamental changes in the nature of royal authority throughout Scandinavian kingdoms. The Christian kings who emerge from this transformation derive their legitimacy not from prowess in battle or success in raiding, but from divine appointment that connects earthly rule to heavenly sanction. Picture these new monarchs as they embrace ceremonies of coronation and anointing that transform Viking chieftains into Christian rulers whose authority depends upon church approval rather than warrior assemblies. Their royal regalia incorporating crosses and Christian symbols that replace the hammers of Thor and ravens of Odin that had adorned their pagan predecessors. The administrative systems that support these Christianized kingdoms require institutional innovations that transcend the informal leadership structures that had governed traditional Viking society. The written laws that replace oral custom reflect influence from continental European legal traditions, while the bureaucratic institutions that emerge to govern settled territories demonstrate adaptation of ecclesiastical administrative models to secular purposes. The transformation proves so thorough that within generations of Harald's death, Scandinavian kingdoms operate according to governmental principles that would be recognizable to their European contemporaries while remaining alien to their own Viking ancestors. Yet the warrior energy that had driven Viking expansion for 3 centuries cannot simply disappear through royal decree or religious conversion, as the cultural traditions that celebrate military courage and seek glory through combat remain deeply embedded within Scandinavian consciousness. The solution that emerges to this potential source of domestic instability reflects the genius of medieval Christianity for channeling potentially destructive forces toward constructive purposes through the institution of crusading warfare that promises spiritual rewards for military service in holy causes. Picture the scene in Scandinavian royal courts during the late 11th and early 12th centuries, where preachers of the First Crusade discover audiences whose warrior traditions make them natural recruits for expeditions that promise both adventure and salvation. The young men who had once dreamed of Viking raids now embrace crusading as the legitimate outlet for martial ambitions that Christian society can approve rather than condemn. The skills that their fathers had used to terrorize Christian monasteries now serve to liberate Christian holy places from Islamic control, while the organizational capabilities that had enabled Viking conquest find new expression in the complex logistics required for successful crusading campaigns. The Scandinavian contingents that participate in the First Crusade demonstrate how completely Viking military culture has adapted to the requirements of Christian warfare, as their leaders embrace tactical innovations that combine traditional Norse fighting techniques with the disciplined coordination that crusading success demands. The fleets that carry these northern crusaders to the Holy Land follow routes that Viking explorers had pioneered, yet their cargo of pilgrims and holy warriors represents purposes that transcend anything contemplated by their pagan predecessors. The transformation proved so complete that former enemies now fight alongside Scandinavian forces in defense of Christian civilization against Islamic expansion. The economic foundations that had supported Viking expansion undergo parallel transformation as Scandinavian kingdoms develop commercial relationships that provide wealth through trade rather than tribute, production rather than plunder. The silver that had once flowed into Nordic treasuries through successful raiding now comes from exports of timber, fish, and iron that serve the growing material needs of medieval European civilization. Picture the harbors of Bergen and Stockholm during this period of transition, where merchant vessels have replaced dragon ships, while their cargo holds contain trade goods rather than weapons, their crews speaking of profit margins rather than battle glory. The cultural achievements that flourish during this transformation demonstrate how successfully Viking civilization has channeled its creative energies toward pursuits that serve Christian rather than pagan purposes. The saga literature that preserves memories of heroic ancestors represents more than simple nostalgia for vanished greatness. It embodies sophisticated literary achievement that rivals anything produced by contemporary European culture, while maintaining distinctively Scandinavian characteristics that distinguish Nordic contribution to medieval civilization. The stone churches that replace wooden temples throughout Scandinavia demonstrate architectural innovations that combine Christian functional requirements with decorative traditions that preserve essential elements of Viking artistic identity. Yet perhaps the most significant aspect of this transformation involves the peaceful integration of Scandinavian kingdoms into the broader political and cultural community of medieval Christendom, as former raiders become respected members of the European royal family through marriage alliances and diplomatic relationships that would have been impossible during the age of Viking expansion. The Norwegian princess who becomes Queen of England represents the complete reversal of traditional relationships between Scandinavian and English royal houses, while the Swedish kings who established diplomatic relations with the Holy Roman Empire demonstrate how thoroughly Viking isolation from continental politics has been overcome. The last expressions of traditional Viking culture appear in remote territories, where geographical isolation preserves customs and values that have disappeared from the more accessible regions of Scandinavia. Picture the final generation of Viking warriors as they gather in Icelandic halls, where the old stories still command respect and the ancient gods retain some measure of devotion, their conversations preserving memories of adventures and achievements that younger generations can scarcely believe. These aging veterans represent the living link between the heroic age of Viking expansion and the settled Christian kingdoms that have emerged from its transformation, their presence serving as a reminder of possibilities that once seemed limitless but have now contracted to the boundaries that medieval European civilization imposes upon martial ambition. The archaeological evidence that marks this transition tells its own story of cultural transformation, as grave goods that had once included weapons and ships give way to Christian symbols and devotional objects that reflect the redirection of Scandinavian spiritual life toward new purposes. The runic inscriptions that had once invoked the protection of pagan gods now bear Christian prayers and biblical quotations, while the artistic motifs that decorate metalwork and stone carving gradually abandon traditional Norse mythological themes in favor of Christian symbolism that connects Scandinavian culture to the broader artistic traditions of Europe. The final symbolic moment in this long transformation arrives with the destruction of the last great pagan temple at Uppsala, where Swedish kings had once sacrificed to Odin and Thor in ceremonies that celebrated the warrior values that had driven Viking expansion across the known world. Picture this ancient sanctuary as Christian axes reduce its carved pillars to kindling, while its sacred groves fall before saws that clear ground for the church that will rise in its place. The smoke from burning timbers carrying away the last physical remnants of religious traditions that had inspired 3 centuries of Nordic adventure and conquest. The age that ends with Uppsala's destruction has reshaped European civilization in ways that its Viking architects could never have imagined, leaving cultural, political, and genetic legacies that survive long after the dragon ships have rotted in forgotten harbors and the warriors who sailed them have found their final rest in Christian graveyards. The transformation proves so complete that within a century of Harald Hardrada's death, Scandinavian kingdoms have become indistinguishable from their European neighbors in governmental structure, religious observance, and cultural achievement, their Viking past preserved only in the sagas that celebrate ancestors whose exploits seem to belong to a different world entirely. The silence that settles over Scandinavian waters in the wake of the Viking Age's conclusion carries within it echoes of 3 centuries that reshaped the very foundations of European civilization, their reverberations extending far beyond the immediate geographical boundaries of Norse expansion to influence developments whose ultimate consequences remain visible in the modern world. The dragon ships that once carved their wake across unknown seas have long since returned to the earth from which their timbers grew, yet the pathways they pioneered continue to channel the flow of human culture across oceans that their crews first dared to navigate, through courage that transcended every limitation their ancestors had accepted as immutable. Picture yourself standing today on the rocky shores of a Norwegian fjord, where archaeologists carefully brush centuries of accumulated soil from the remains of a Viking longship, each recovered artifact telling stories that illuminate aspects of medieval life that written chronicles never recorded. The iron rivets that once held together vessels capable of crossing the North Atlantic reveal metallurgical techniques that influenced shipbuilding throughout medieval Europe, while the personal possessions found alongside these maritime remains speak of individual lives whose ambitions carried them far from the familiar landscapes of their birth. And merchant scales discovered in a Dublin excavation connect Irish Viking settlements to trade networks that spanned from Greenland to Constantinople, while a child's wooden toy carved in the shape of a dragon ship reminds us that the age of exploration touched every aspect of Scandinavian society. The linguistic legacy that survives from 3 centuries of Viking expansion permeates modern European languages in ways that few speakers recognize, as words borrowed from Old Norse continue to shape daily communication throughout territories that once knew the sound of dragon ships approaching through morning mist. The English language bears particularly deep Scandinavian influence, with fundamental vocabulary ranging from everyday terms like sky, egg, and knife to legal concepts like law and husband that reflect the profound cultural synthesis that emerged from Viking settlement in the Danelaw. Even the pronouns that structure English grammar preserve Norse influence, while place names ending in by, thorp, and thwaite map the geographical extent of Scandinavian colonization across landscapes that their original inhabitants could never have imagined would bear foreign names for a millennium and more. The legal traditions that emerged from Viking settlements demonstrate how thoroughly Norse concepts of justice and governance influenced European political development, as the democratic assemblies that had regulated Scandinavian society adapted to territorial administration in ways that anticipated later constitutional developments. The Althing of Iceland represents perhaps the most remarkable achievement in this regard, establishing parliamentary principles that influenced political theory throughout medieval Europe, while demonstrating that effective governance could emerge from voluntary association rather than royal imposition. The trial by jury that becomes fundamental to English common law reflects Scandinavian legal procedures, while concepts of individual rights that seem characteristically modern trace their ancestry to Norse traditions that valued personal honor above social hierarchy. The artistic achievements that flow from Viking cultural synthesis continue to influence European aesthetic development long after their creators have been forgotten, as the distinctive styles that emerged from contact between Norse traditions and local artistic vocabularies spread throughout medieval Europe through commercial and diplomatic networks. The illuminated manuscripts produced in Irish monasteries bear decorative motifs that reflect Viking metalworking techniques, while the stone carving that adorns Romanesque churches throughout Northern Europe demonstrates the influence of Scandinavian artistic traditions on Christian architectural development. The sophisticated metalwork discovered in Viking graves reveals aesthetic sensibilities that challenge every stereotype about barbarian crudeness, while the textiles that survive from Scandinavian settlements demonstrate weaving techniques that influenced fabric production throughout medieval Europe. Yet, perhaps the most profound legacy of the Viking Age emerges through the genetic inheritance that 3 centuries of expansion distributed throughout European populations, as modern DNA analysis reveals Scandinavian ancestry in regions whose historical records preserve no memory of Norse settlement. The Irish, who carry genetic markers that link them to Norwegian fjords, bear witness to Viking expansion that extended far beyond the documented settlements of Dublin and Cork, while the British populations, whose DNA reflects Danish influence, demonstrate how thoroughly medieval conquest could transform demographic composition. From Iceland to Russia, from Normandy to the Scottish Islands, the genetic legacy of Viking expansion continues to shape human populations, whose modern identities reflect synthesis between indigenous traditions and Scandinavian innovation. The modern fascination with Viking culture reveals something essential about contemporary consciousness. that finds inspiration in their example of individuals who refused to accept the limitations that geography and tradition imposed upon their ancestors' ambitions. The television series, novels, and historical studies that celebrate Viking achievement speak to audiences whose comfortable modern existence still responds to stories of adventure and exploration that transcend conventional boundaries. Yet this popular interest often obscures the sophisticated reality of Viking civilization in favor of romantic images that emphasize violence while ignoring the commercial, artistic, and political achievements that enabled their expansion to succeed where simple military conquest would have failed. The archaeological discoveries that continue to emerge from Viking Age sites throughout Europe and beyond reveal how much remains unknown about a civilization whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries that written chronicles document. The recent discovery of Viking settlements in North America confirms saga accounts that historians had dismissed as mythological, while excavations in unexpected locations continue to extend the geographical range of Scandinavian influence. Each new find adds complexity to our understanding of medieval European development, while demonstrating how incomplete written records can be when documenting cultural changes that occur over centuries rather than individual lifetimes. As evening light fades across the waters where dragon ships once carried the hopes and ambitions of the northern peoples toward horizons that promised adventure beyond anything their ancestors had imagined possible, their legacy continues to work its transformation within the consciousness of those who inherit the world they helped to create. The Vikings, who emerged from Scandinavian obscurity to reshape European civilization, achieved something that transcends their individual accomplishments. They demonstrated that human courage and ingenuity can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable, while creating opportunities that transform entire civilizations. The fjords that witnessed their departure still reflect the same northern light that illuminated their first voyages toward unknown shores, while the winds that filled their sails continue to whisper across waters that remember the passage of vessels whose crews dared to believe that the edge of the world might mark not an ending, but a beginning. Their ships have returned to the elements from which human skill fashioned them, yet the pathways they opened through human consciousness remain as navigable today as when the first dragon ship carved its wake across virgin seas toward destinies that would reshape the map of human possibility forever.